Hi, this is for Dr. Wilson, but anybody, please jump in. I'm working with the quality improvement system in Arizona when it comes to improving the quality in childcare. One of the questions or issues that keeps coming up is on implicit or unconscious bias of the teachers in regards to the children. Some of it stems from the Yale Eye Gaze study, where the preschool teachers were looking more at the African American boy, and then maybe the African American girl, and then the white boy and the white girl. An issue I have though is that with unconscious bias, it's almost kind of a ghost of a ghost. It's this unconscious thought. They don't necessarily, do they know that they're looking at one particular person as opposed to another? We know that the issue is there, that's clear. A question that I have is, what do we do about unconscious bias when, like I said, it's a ghost of a ghost and we don't even know that it's there?
So are you working with them directly, or they're in school with them, or what's your relationship?
So what I'm doing is I coach new technical assistants with child cares in improving their quality. I tend to focus more on infant mental health and challenging behaviors in working with individuals in that. The reason that I bring this up is because we attend conferences where implicit bias or unconscious bias is talked about a lot. But mostly what I hear about is that this problem exists. What I don't hear about is, what do we do about that?
Okay. I need to be honest. I have this relationship with the store I tell you about, okay? I haven't fixed them at all. But if you have a good relationship with the family, I guess I would suggest a couple of things. Particularly if you're working with them, if you can just practice with them. If your relationship is good enough that you can actually walk them through some of the things that are going on. Just really sit down and work it out with them in terms of practicing, have them role play a scenario. Is it bothering them? Is it that this is happening?
Now that they're learning about it, they're more, they feel bad about it if they think they might be doing this. They start to wonder themselves, am I having this unconscious bias I don't know about, and I don't want it to affect the kids I'm working with?
The hard part is that they may have to just ignore it and keep be direct and just work and do whatever, do in that setting what they want to do, and just and not let it ignore it. I'm trying to say that's the hard thing. But if you can, I would suggest role playing with them, working out scenarios that they can actually address the clerk or the person more directly about it. I like them coming up because they do carry my clothes and stuff around and follow me. I go from store to store and people look at us. So as long as they don't keep doing it, but that's separate because I don't let it bother me.
Yeah.
But for other people, I think the more realistic thing is to, they could talk, bring it up more directly and just talk about it. At some point, I'm going to do that. I'm going to bring it up directly to the store manager whenever I see him, since I know him by name now.
Right.
But, and I'm being serious. Smile, but I'm actually being serious.
Yeah. The
story is there and it exists. But right now, I'm using them, so.
Right.
And so I.
I kind of want to start with a joke, and I thought about saying, I hope nobody gets offended, but actually I don't care. I was just thinking about you saying, oh, there's a time in history when an SOB pays off. It does today. You can be president. You said there was a time when it pays off to be an SOB in history, and I said, no, today, you can be president. But, So my thought was on prenatal care. My personal belief is that maybe therapy or behavioral health should be a normal part of prenatal care. You know, like vitamins or whatever. But my thought on that, I was hoping to get everybody's opinion, because you brought in a very interesting idea on, you know, born bad. What effect on those genetics on development does external stress have? So Dr. Julius Harrington did a study on African American women who did negative self-talk due to oppression, right? Due to the racist things that they experience, and what effects it had on development of the baby in utero and birth conflicts and things like that. And then we see that, you know, depressed moms between the ages of 1 and 3, you know, have a really big effect. And so I'm wondering if there's any credence to the idea that the born bad idea could be from outside forces in utero affecting the child.
You know, I'm a great believer these days. Okay, that no matter what the phenotype is, some of us were born that way and some of us were made that way. So I can certainly imagine that there are prenatal stressors that lead a fetus to develop in a certain way that we would not value and is very hard to correct. And I can also imagine that there are fetuses who simply inherit those proclivities and they're not induced by prenatal stress. And the same thing for things we value. And that, in fact, I would summarize it this way, that 2 of us behave exactly the same, or many of us behave exactly the same. Some of us were born that way and some of us were made that way. For some of us, nature is a much stronger writer than nurture. And for others of us, nurture is a much stronger writer than is nature. So I would say it's perfectly reasonable that prenatal stress could induce any number of different phenotypes, depending on the stressors, when they occurred, what systems they affected, etc.
I would say that, you know, certainly there's data to suggest that stress in pregnancy is related to lots of outcomes that, you know, we would rather kids not experience. But I think more generally, it speaks to the point that there are these time points and there are these contexts where we could just be doing better screening for lots of things that might make a difference in kids' lives. So the prenatal period is one where a lot of women, not enough women, but a lot of women are being seen in primary care essentially. And we could be screening for depression, we could be screening for adverse experiences, we could be screening for a lot of things that might help them and then down the road help their kids. You know, school settings are settings where we could be screening for things that might help us refer kids to services. Pediatric primary care is a place where we could be screening. And you know, those efforts require more joined-up services than most places currently have. But I think the point that, you know, these are all times and places where we could be doing a much better job of screening kids and screening families for things that might make a difference in their lives is well taken.
I think this might get a different.
So my apologies in advance. This is not really a direct question, but it's a 3-part food for thought, and you can comment on. And the first thing is the whole idea of so what. I don't want to belabor the point, but what it feels like for me is that, you know, by way of story, there's this quantum physicist sitting in his lab, her lab, comes up with this great, wow, that's really cool. And then somewhere down the line, there's an engineer that goes, hey, I could make something really nice out of that. And they build this really nice thing. And pretty soon, I've got a smartphone in my hand that's got over 1 million apps available for it, of which about a dozen are useful. And I kind of have to pick and choose. And then I'm using those apps with people that I work with, and they're kind of scratching their heads, okay, yeah, maybe. And they try and use those things. So how do we flatten, you know, that's a really culturally enforced hierarchy. How do we kind of flatten that so those end users, and for me those are families, children that I work with, can actually start to inform more directly where this research goes, what the physicist looks at, what the engineer develops, and what I end up with in my hand. The second thought was, particularly around Jay this morning, you know, plus what we talked about this afternoon about not being able to predict. Right now there's a measles outbreak. Imagine that. But measles doesn't kill everybody. It doesn't even make everybody really sick. But some people get really sick and some people do die. And what we do is we immunize everybody, that herd immunity, because we don't have a better technology right now. So if I'm using something with a family right now, and I can look at and think, wow, maybe this is useless for this particular child, I have to look at the ripple effect beyond that. Maybe I'm working with this parent, and this parent, and most parents I work with don't have one child, they have several. Maybe it's not working with this specific child, but maybe it works with one of the other children in this family, or maybe she's also the aunt and primary caregiver for another child, and it works with that child. So there's that kind of immunity response, herd immunity. And the third thing, just if I can engage everybody just for a moment. Keep it brief, less than a minute. If you stand up around your table, really quick, just stand up, look at your table, look at the tabletop. Think of that tabletop as a whole person, and that's the whole person. You know, think of the child, the family that you're working with. Pick one object on the table and put your focus on that object. Just focus on it. And what do you notice about that thing? And then physically, half the distance between your eyeballs and that object, that's going to require you to bend over, look at it. So physically move yourself closer to that object. Put your eyeballs closer to it. Notice what you notice now. What do you notice about that? What do you notice now that you didn't notice before about that particular object? Okay? And now, and this because it's abbreviated, I want you to get so close that your focus is almost blurry on that particular object. But what do you notice about that object? What do you see now that you didn't see before? Isn't that really cool? And then stand back up and realize, but we're looking at the whole. Okay? We're really trying to look at the whole. And I think we get over-focused on problems. We turn into this thing, and then everything becomes a problem. But we don't see the whole person, because no kid that I work with is violent all the time. No kid I know is oppositional all the time. Okay? They have skills, they have strengths. What are those that we can bring to bear? And then for everything else, it's, you know, the confirmation bias we get, the closer we look at something, oh yes, this reinforces what we already know, and it's bad, and it's bad, and it's bad, and it's really bad, but it's not. We step back, and we take in that larger view. It's not really all bad. There are things there that we can use. Thanks for indulging.
I have a comment. One of the remarkable things about our families is that when we start working with them, their kids are 2 years old. Now that they are 14, we're actually seeing some of their own joy in terms of having kids and actually not wanting to let them go, you know, because they're having so much. This is for the treatment families, that when we go over, when we call them, we'll hear a lot of happy talk around them. I'm not sure if that was what you were getting at, but the kids, the families, are really kicking it up in terms of just their pleasure of being with each other and working with each other.
And I just wanted to quickly comment on your first point about what are we doing with all this information and how is it changing things, because we're all doing our little pieces. And I think that's one of the challenges of doing research, is how you get it into the hands of the people who need to use this. And I think as researchers, we often never want to overstate our findings, because there's always exceptions or error. We always want to be cautious. But it doesn't do any good if it sits on the shelf either. And so one of the things that I've found is bringing the science back to the people who use it every day, letting them digest it, help interpret it. And What I've also found being most effective is that if we do know something is different or that can work, start changing policies and practices and getting this to the people who actually make legislative decisions, who start legislating how we treat people in general. And if we know there's certain ways to treat them, like, it wasn't until 2005 that we abolished the juvenile death penalty. Before that, we were still executing our children in the United States. People don't realize that the juvenile death penalty has just been abolished. And it wasn't until 2015 that we abolished the life without possibility of parole for juveniles. So not understanding the laws that impact, so bringing the science to the people who use that, I think is something that we all have to be better at doing and building those bridges. So I think your point's really well taken.
All right. I want to comment on something that came up before about pregnancy and factors of influencing the development of the fetus and the mentality of the child afterwards. And recent studies have shown mothers depressed before, during, and after pregnancy has a high level of effect on the children, moving them towards depression. Now, in terms of the epigenetics of it, the same applies to the male partner. In other words, if the male partner is in bad health, is depressed before, during, and after pregnancy, it has a similar effect on the child. I just mentioned that in response to the previous comment. My comment has to do with I would say picking up on the last commenter's point, we're seeing things from a very, very local perspective, the local perspective of our time in our culture. And I personally don't feel that we can make sense of what's going on unless we introduce the evolutionary perspective. For instance, when I think about the difficulties that male children are having today, it's in the context of today. But when I think of it from an evolutionary point of view, the male parent 300 years ago, 500 years, 4,000 years ago, had a completely different relationship with the child. There was basically a mentorship. There was the children, the same-sex children bonded to that parent. Now, where 50% of our children are growing up without a birth parent, and it's more than 85% and 90% the male parent, from an evolutionary perspective, what we're looking at is the effects of our social engineering or our culture at this moment. So I think that we can't just, every one of the presenters presented a very, very wonderful picture of what's going on now and their investigation of it. But I would like to bring one point that might be important for the psychologist in particular, has to do with attachment theory. Everything we hear today in regard to understanding the, so to speak, outcomes in terms of parent-child relations relates to attachment and attachment theory. And what does attachment theory mean? I've read hundreds of papers on attachment, and it always refers to the mother-child relationship. Now, if we went back to the 1700s or the 1800s, before attachment theory became au courant, it would be the connection to the father that was important. So we're looking at these biased pictures of what's happening to our boys in, so to speak, our current cultural context. So I would just ask the presenters if they want to say a word about whatever they presented contextually. That it is what is understood today. But if they were to look at it contextually, how would they shift their view?
One way to think about it is that, some of the best evidence on, what at least contributes to adolescent behavioral difficulties is affiliation with other deviant peers. one can wonder if you go out to hunter-gatherer societies, even those exist today, to say nothing about those that are long gone. Were there ever deviant peer groups in small communities? Or did you have an excess of, tolerably well socialized for that culture children? So because of father absence, because of population density, because of age segregation in the modern Western world, do we have deviant peer groups? And are these novel environments to, if you would, seduce kids into bad behavior? And in that regard, cultures are very different. I've been living in Japan, and one of the interesting things in Japan is, if you're in a preschool setting in Japan, and a kid misbehaves, or let's say in the USA, what happens? The teacher goes and intervenes. The Japanese philosophy is very different, and it carries some risks for bullying, because it's the peer group that is the socialization agent. So the other kids are the ones who are keeping that kid from behaving. I'm just pointing out two dramatic examples of very dramatically different cultural practices, and that those are exposing children to very different environments to adapt to. And so I think you're perfectly correct that what we see going on in this modern, highly individualistic society, where, families have broken down and religious institutions no longer have the role to play, et cetera, may not be particularly representative of what's going on in the rest of the world, or in much of human history even.
Your point that many of these experiences that we have been talking about today are culturally constructed is well taken, right? So maltreatment has been defined differently in different historical periods. But I don't, and I think that there's a recognition of that, right? So if I'm talking about maltreatment now, the reason that I'm talking about it as a risk factor for violence is because it's not normative, right? It's not a normative caregiving practice. And there's actually research on this now, this question of just how does the normativeness of a parenting practice matter in terms of the way that parenting practice affects children. So there's been this really interesting cross-cultural research, for instance, on harsh physical discipline, showing that in countries where harsh physical discipline is perceived as a normative parenting practice, that's just something you do with your kids, and kids understand that that's just some way that's a way that parents discipline kids. Being smacked by your parents it's not a risk factor for antisocial behavior, whereas in countries where it's less normative, it's perceived as an aberrant parenting practice, it is a risk factor for kids' antisocial behavior. So I think there is an awareness that these things are somewhat culturally constructed.
To what extent in that situation is it also the case, not simply that it's normative, but it's not equated with I'm being rejected, I'm not being loved. So it's the relationship context in which harsh punishment occurs. So my dad pays no attention to me, but when he comes home drunk, he beats the hell out of me, is very different than my father takes out the strap or takes me out to the field and gets the switch because, he's devoted to me and he cares about me.
And it's the context of the whole society that's doing that. So I totally agree with you about that.
Well, I just would thank you all.
I think
we're talking about cross-cultural versus evolutionary.
Yeah, I think we should. Thank you. Next person.
I just wanted to say that I appreciate what my colleague was talking about with implicit bias. I'm an infant mental health specialist, and I do similar work to his with caregivers and families. And I think I want to take a chance to talk about and comment about that implicit bias can become explicit bias. And the reason I mention that right now is one of the battles that I continually have with caregivers. And when I say battles, it's not a battle, it's a conversation. It's a reflective practice and a reflective conversation about shared language and strengths-based language. And so I have to be honest that I'm really concerned when we start to think of newborn babies as SOBs. SOBs. Or,
Thank you. I was waiting for that kind of response because it just struck me.
I'd like to finish, please.
What
Or that they're born bad. If we were to think of Saruf and risk and resiliency and strengths-based perspective, and that we're all adaptive, that young child, no matter what risk factor they're born with, which we know they are born with risk factors. Some of them are born with holes in their hearts. Some of them are born with other sickle cell. There's all kinds of things that our children are born with, but that doesn't make them SOBs. It's our perspective and our implicit or explicit bias that creates that perspective. And so when I think about a caregiver that I've been working with in a childcare classroom who's struggling to help a child, whether they're black or white or Asian or Hispanic, and they're struggling to work with that child in a strengths-based perspective because the initial transaction started with bad behavior, then if I can't help to frame that from a way of thinking about it, of what is it from within me that is perceiving this bad behavior this way and not able to clean the slate in the next transaction with this child. And I guess I'm really concerned again that here I am working in environments where not everybody knows how to be strengths-based. We're all on a spectrum of learning. But here I come to a conference and we're calling newborn babies SOBs. I'm really concerned about that.
Well, I welcome that critique. I really do. And I think it's a legitimate critique, and I'm glad somebody's raised it. But I want to push back. I want to push back and say that, the world is full of variation. We value some of that variation a lot more than others. And if I had said that some kids are just born nice and good and friendly, I suspect we'd have a lot easier time swallowing that. I think nice and good and friendly has paid off in the past, in spades, which is why we have the capacity for it. But I think being an advantage taker, an angry one, makes good sense in certain ecological niches, and those have existed in the past. I don't think you can have 40% of kids who have that proclivity and have a functional society. But I want us to appreciate the fact that there's a lot, that we can have all sorts of phenotypes that have proven successful in the past, both because they've been developmentally induced by experience and exposures, and because, or at least entertain the possibility, because there are individuals who are born as what I call fixed strategists. These are cards you play because at a certain time in history, being just a nice person really paid off because you were fortunate enough to be born maybe into a nicer world, and you really didn't have to develop that through outside tuition. But I think the same holds for the other side, because God knows the world hasn't always been a nice place. So while I welcome that concern, and I think it's a legitimate one to raise, I still push back and say, can we accept the idea that some kids are just born nice with pleasant temperaments and they're really resistant to turning into SOBs? Well, if that's the case, then I think we need to entertain the other side or the other dimensions of human variation as well from the same perspective.
May I just respond to that quickly? I challenge the thinking that children are born with temperaments. I challenge the thinking that children are born with temperaments. And I'll support that because I know that's a very unpopular view. But I support that with adaptation theory, in that children are born with needs. All of them are. And some needs are biological based, some are genetic based, some are in utero based, some are based on mom's ghosts in the nursery and her angels in the nursery, or dad's also. So temperament, if we really believe in adaptation theory, temperament is fluid, just like IQ is.
I think your premise is exactly the one where we disagree, which is I don't believe entirely in the adaptation theory that you do, because I think, the analogy here is investing. The first rule of investing is don't invest when you can't afford to lose. The second rule is don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify your investments. Why? Because the future is uncertain. You don't know what's going to pay off. Passing genes through generations is the same exact economy. You don't know what forms of variation are going to pay off in the future. And so there's been, I would argue, natural selection for all kinds of differences, including, this is my central take-home message, including the trait of how susceptible to the environment I will be. Robert Pullman has made the point to me, and I've now come to understand it many years later, that if nurture was the order of the day, we could all become Nazis. Not everybody did become a Nazi. Or we'd all become Trumpians. But the fact of the matter is, we aren't all susceptible to our exposures. Not everybody who was exposed to an earthquake as a fetus, well, that increases the rate of schizophrenia in the fetus's future. It doesn't do it to all fetuses. Because some are more, I wouldn't say vulnerable, I don't like that term anymore. Some are more taking their cues from the environment. Because in the past and in the future, that's really paid off to go left when the wind blows left and to go right when the wind blows right. But there are other times when it's made good sense just to go this way or go that way or go that way. Because at times in the past, it's easy for me to think that's paid off. So we end up with genetic variation across people, including to the extent to which they are, quote, environmentally programmable. And I think it makes sense that we all shouldn't be environmentally programmable, because we can't count on a benign environment to turn us all into nice people. So I think the real tension here between us is, are we all equally susceptible to contextual developmental regulation by our experiences and our exposures? And I think that's an individual difference.
Perhaps in the next context, we'll find out we're both wrong.
To some extent, I'm sure that's right.
I'm really hoping this will be my final question on a controversial trajectory. During the Vietnam War era, at some point, the U.S. military lowered its standards in order to get sufficient troops into their program. One of these programs was known as Project 100,000. A nickname of the program is also McNamara's Morons. So what they did, among other things, was to bring in low IQ recruits to go fight in the jungles of Vietnam. They had difficulties with training some of these troops because they weren't up to the task. An example was in grenade training. The troops were skipping the grenades across the ground because they couldn't absorb the lesson that you needed to throw your grenade in an arc. These people were sent in to fight in Vietnam, and I believe they died at a disproportionate number. They actually sold the program partly as a rehabilitative program, and at the time, one of the theories was that they could rehabilitate these gentlemen. For example, showing them videotapes that yes, we will raise their IQ, we will improve them, this type of thing. To keep it brief, sorry, I have a difficulty with that. The ultimate question to which I've been leading, and I've been hinting and poking around, and I know it's a very controversial area, is this relates to Dr. Kaufman's talk. What did you say the average IQ of the offenders in the prison system, or the people who were convicted, was? I believe it was 85, right? 85. One of the numbers that I found nauseating and disturbing in my personal research is the measured IQ of the US black population. Is somebody familiar with that number? It's 85. And I have found that number so disturbing that I have kept pressing on this question because we have such a panel of experts here. It's one of the most disturbing numbers I've seen in all of my social and political sort of readings on this topic. And the question, I guess, the idea is to reframe the issue. If, two sentences or three here.
Just get to the question.
Yeah. If there's an overrepresentation among violent offenders, among lower IQ individuals, and that could be one of the reasons we see more males because of the greater variability on IQ among males relative to females. If we have these differences in population, I'll leave it at that, but basically the question is, can we reframe this as not being a male issue, and certainly not being a race issue, although that's part of where I've been coming from, but as an IQ-related issue? And the question is whether that's a legitimate approach, and also, as among all of the other factors, and specifically, what can be done about these numbers? Regardless of your race, what can be done practically about the numbers in order to help these populations in order to deal with the issue that they are, regardless of race, presenting higher within the criminal justice system and the rate of violent offenders? Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think your question is a bit off in the sense of those who are violent has nothing to do with IQ. It's those who are incarcerated in the sense that systems are more likely to, because we have people who commit violent acts who are not caught, who are not detected, which is why we measure both.
Yes.
So to make this assumption that somehow that's the underlying factor is not
well, of a significant subtype. That was the idea. I mean, there are clearly, if you're somebody like Semyon Mogilevich, who's out running massive gangster schemes in the former Soviet Union, yeah, I think he's brilliant, and those type of people are doing very well. I was talking specifically about the lower IQ populations.
So there's someone behind you, and we're
close
to end. Thank you.
You know, I'm sure we would all like to see a world that is more peaceful, less violent. And for those of the four of you who would care to comment on it, any ideas about public policy that could be promoted based upon your research? What public policy changes would you like to see, practical or impractical?
That's where I spent half my life. I don't know if everybody else is, but I spent a lot of time working with the justice system on refining the laws that we have about criminalizing adolescents, trying to work more on rehabilitative efforts, given what we know developmentally about kids. I mean, the juvenile court was established in 1899, so it was during that time that we actually realized kids are different, and then the pendulum swung to a much more punitive, and now we're moving back to that rehabilitative. I think we have an option here, or an opportunity here, to change policy, getting parents involved. In fact, some of the research we've done, we now do parent trainings when kids are arrested to actually help parents navigate the system, just like trying to navigate healthcare. You know, we all try to navigate that, it's impossible. Try navigating the justice system, it's even worse. Training parents and helping them do that. One of the things that we have a responsibility to do is to get these policies changed, getting more services to kids and policies that are more developmentally appropriate. So that's a lot of the work that we do with our research.
Yeah, I would recommend that we go back to the visiting nurse program, or even just put in place nationwide programs that Professor O, that Danny's now working on. I mean, there are lots of early child development programs that would be very, very useful. And I do have a comment to the gentleman who asked that other question. Please go and find my colleagues Eric Turkheimer's work. Read all of it because he talks about your 85% and what it means. I mean, it's a big zero. You should really read it. He does a very good job to answering your questions. No more comments on that.
My recommendations are around joined up services. So in pediatric primary care, for example, and vetting social workers and vetting psychologists. In schools, co-locating physical health services for kids in schools, for example. And there are efforts to do that. They're just small scale and they're very localized. But I think that would be enormously helpful.
I mean, I'm going to end up sounding probably like a progressive Democrat here. I mean, I think one of the great inequities in this society is that, our education system, and this is in the early years, is based on a local tax base. And we're all in a conflict of interest, especially we educated elite, because, we can advocate for equal funding, but then when we want our own kids, we want the best schools for them. So we live in a society in which we kind of institutionalized educational inequity, not, I don't think, intentionally, or unless that was the reason why, schooling was tied to the local tax base, because people knew that way the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer. I don't presume that. So I think we need a radical refunding strategy for our school systems. Otherwise, we're going to get a lot of loss there. I think in terms of nutrition and homelessness and warm clothing, I mean, the bottom line comes that what does a child deserve? I come back to this. No child ever asked to be here. And to me, that has a moral implication, which that every child in an affluent society has coming to them some minimum decent quality of life. And God knows, and in fact, I would go a little further for us behavioral and psychological scientists who do all this work, that I think one of the things we've done, or we risk doing, is commodifying children. That is, why do we provide services? Why does David Olds have to go out and do a cost-benefit analysis to show that something is worthwhile? That is, why do we have to show that child abuse harms kids? Who cares if it harms kids down the developmental road? It's painful. Nobody volunteers to be beaten. That should be the reason why we don't beat kids. Not because it undermines human capital. I mean, that's a secondary consideration. But I think we saw this dramatically in the Trumpian family separation policy. Because what did all the developmental scholars and the psychologists talk about? They talked about long-term traumatic consequences. My response is, fuck that. You're torturing 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, and 3-year-olds by forcibly taking them away from their parents. What would you feel if somebody put you in a room and said, until you do something, I am going to let you watch me, cut off the fingers of your children? That would be emotional, psychological torture. We wouldn't stand for it. Taking a 1-year-old forcibly from their parent, a 2-year-old forcibly from their parent, and not even knowing where they go, and sending them thousands of miles away, I'm sorry. That's torture. And nobody calls it torture, because they're all worried about the developmental consequences of trauma. And I think, therefore, we lose sight of the fact of the moral claim on what children deserve by justifying what they deserve because of some long-term consequence. And the real risk there is when the services that we think will remediate or prevent don't do it, then people say, what are we doing it for? The fact of the matter is, good quality daycare, which the rhetoric is all about, is going to be good for children, has very, very small effects. And the science of that has had no impact on the advocates of good quality daycare. Now, that is not an argument against good quality daycare. The argument against good quality daycare is every child deserves a decent, minimum quality standard of life in an affluent society. End of story.
And I think our science of child development has risked losing sight of that, inadvertently, unintentionally. But we live in a world now where we invest in children if we can get a return on that investment. And I think that is a serious scandal.
Ian, you have the last question.
Thank you. I will keep it very brief and stay true to that. Put very simply, at least as a researcher, my question is, how happy are you with your dependent variables? But to unpack that a little bit, it came up in one of the earlier presentations about the sort of accepted limitations of criminology and measures in terms of offending that come through the court system. Because, as the last presenter brought up, we know those are the ones that get caught and are unlucky to also lose the court case, as it were. So we know there are inherent biases and racial dimensions in terms of who gets caught and who can't afford to get off the hook. But my concern is, if we stick with these measures that are so skewed towards zero reports and towards these biases, that we may always be steps behind trying to have measures that are more holistic, just as we're trying to do that on the cumulative risk side, but on the actual outcome or dependent variable side, to be thinking collectively about how we develop better measures of violent outcomes.
I think your question about measurement is one that we all struggle with, and we all tend to put people into, like, what is violent offending? And I think if we went around this room and all came up with a definition, we might not all agree with the same definition. And that's where I think research struggles, because you can present a host of research studies, and they all could have defined violence a bit differently, and yet we put them all together. So it's a struggle, I think, within the literature, within measurement, within all of the stuff that we do about how we measure things, which is why I think, psychologists love measurement, and we refine it, and we do psychometricians, and we look at factor structures, and we do all sorts of things to try to say that this measure is really capturing, and look at the reliability and validity. But at the end of the day, what are we really talking about, and what does it translate into for that behavior? And I think that's where we're always struggling, and I think that struggle is going to continue as we work to put this all together. So I think your point's very well taken, and an important one is we always continue to move forward in refining how we do this kind of work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.